Come, let us return to the Lord. He has torn us to pieces, but he will heal us. He has injured us, but he will bind up our wounds. After 2 days, he will revive us. On the third day, he will restore us, that we may live in his presence. Let us acknowledge the Lord. Let us press on to acknowledge him. As surely as the sun rises, he will appear. He will come to us like the winter rains, like the spring rains that water the earth.
When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the lake. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be well and live." So he went with him, and a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I'll be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." When he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's home to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he'd entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child's not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said, "Talitha kum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. Now she was 12 years of age. At this, they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this, and then told them to give her something to eat.
Thank you, Dorothy. Now, for those of you who've been here the last couple of weeks, no, I haven't got the readings wrong. It's because having considered each part of that story in isolation. So 2 weeks ago, we thought about the woman who was bleeding and who was healed. And last week, we thought about Jairus and Jairus' daughter. we thought about them in isolation, as it were, we thought about the individual stories. So this morning, I'm inviting us to reflect on them together and the ways in which they shape and bounce off each other. The writer of this gospel, as all writers has a definite agenda. And not only the event and the teaching around it, but the way in which the story is told is part of what the writer is trying to tell us. And it's clear that there are links between the stories. And to start with, they're both about women. And you don't take that for granted in the gospel stories. The woman has been bleeding for 12 years. The girl is 12 years old. There's a parallel being brought out there. Both of them also raise an issue that we can very easily miss in a culture that isn't that of first century Palestine, that of purity. The woman who's bleeding will have been regarded as unclean. That's the reason why she's isolated. She shouldn't actually be in the crowd. She should be in isolation, because the thing about uncleanness, about impurity, is that the best way to describe it is infectious. You remember, not that long ago, when we stood at a distance from each other so we didn't pass infection on. That's kind of what was going on here. Uncleanness was passed on by touch, and she certainly shouldn't have been touching Jesus. A dead body was also unclean, and going into a house where there was a dead body was to become unclean by extension. Now, we don't need to overplay this. Impurity or uncleanness, on one level, was no big thing. It was dealt with by prayer and sacrifice. It happened, it could be sorted. It wasn't a major disruption to lifestyle, but it is a thing. And people, especially holy people, which is what Jesus was assumed or expected to be as a rabbi, they were expected to avoid situations in which uncleanness would be passed on. That's what's going on in the story of the Good Samaritan, you know that. The priest and the Levite can't stop because you've got a dead body there, and they wouldn't be able to go onto the temple and do their jobs if they became unclean as a result of that. But what's clear from both these stories is that it's not even that Jesus didn't worry about it, he doesn't even seem to see the issue. There's certainly no mention of it. So there's another parallel there. In both of those situations, he is apparently deliberately getting himself into a situation where he really shouldn't be there. And the parallels suggest we're not wrong in reading these stories together and bouncing them off each other. And actually there are various things going on in that help us each one helps us understand the other. We see, for example, the significance that Jesus attaches to women. But I think most significantly is this issue of purity. Because this thing about purity being infectious is one of the things that Jesus completely turns on its head. So the thing about him, we see in other stories, but we see him do it in other stories. But I think here it is so clear, having it happen in the two stories in two different ways, but the same thing happening, that it's not accidental. Where tradition and culture would suggest that the one who is pure should avoid impurity by staying separate, because the threat is that what was impure could overtake, Jesus seems to dash right in, either unconcerned about purity or, and I suggest this is more likely, with the conviction, showing the conviction that actually it works the other way around. That purity, which we could most easily summarize in the story as the presence of God, the activity, the godliness of God being present in the world, that is the infectious agent. So rather than being threatened by what might contaminate him, Jesus goes into situations as the agent that will, as it were, do the contaminating or the infecting, that will affect and change the situation. He didn't need to be protected from what might diminish or harm him, but it works the other way around. He brings what is needed. He brings life and hope into the situation. The existing model assumed that impurity was the strong agent and the pure needed protection, and Jesus' actions claim the opposite. That the pure, the holy, the godly is the strong presence and will overcome what is not godly and indeed will redeem it. So I'm wondering where this takes us. I'm wondering if you were taught, as one of my Sunday school teachers put it, if you touch pitch, you will be defiled. You ever get that? None of you ever got, it must be a Scottish thing. If you touch pitch, if you touch things that are dirty, the dirt transfers onto you, and therefore this was extended into a life lesson. Therefore, you stay away from bad company, you don't go into places where people are doing things that are wrong, so like that. You keep yourself out of that situation. Jesus' practice offers this different model. He says, if I, as this God-centered person, as this person in whom God's life is being lived, if I living out the divine life, if I go into a situation, then that's what becomes true of that situation. Not the harm, not the damage, not the evil we pray to be delivered from, but the presence of God. And might that be true for us? Might there be places and times where, as those who follow Jesus, our presence and our loving service might be bringing life and hope into places that look impure or beyond or outside God's presence and blessing? It's always worth reflecting. Where do we think believers or followers or people of goodwill should be treading carefully because of the dangers of compromise or guilt by association or even guilt? And then putting those ideas up against these stories. Because what Jesus appears to be presenting is this upside downness, holiness and hope by association, the contaminating presence of goodness, not touch, pitch and be defiled, but bring love to touch and purify. In the early part of the 20th century, many Christians in the UK and in the States withdrew from any involvement in politics, and there are a variety of reasons for that. We know during the 19th century, we know stories of Christian progressive action, Christian involvement in resisting slavery, in introducing prison reform, in developing widespread education for children whose parents couldn't afford to pay for it and so on, starting and running hospitals. All of that was going on, and then suddenly, early in the 20th century, it stops. And people in many parts of the church withdraw very deliberately from social action, from political campaigning, from being involved. And this issue around where should Christians be present was part of the motivation. To be involved was to be compromised, was to mix with or work with, or horrors of horrors, negotiate with and allow power to those who were not believers. And so the church drew back and became very isolated. Now that changed again in the middle of the 20th century for all sorts of reasons, but many of us were involved in that kind of change. Church Action on Poverty, campaigns to end poverty now. We were going on demonstrations about ending poverty. Organisations like Christian Aid and Tear Fund and Tradecraft, those are part of what happens in the UK as this turnaround. And it's a turnaround shaped by the recognition in this story that there are no-go areas for Christian concern, because we are not going to be contaminated, but we have the chance to be the contaminant as we take our love, our faith, our commitment to justice into the world. So as a new parliamentary session starts, new people take up seats, there are new relationships developing, new power struggles will take place, new compromises in the messy world of actually getting things done politically. It's important that we are praying for and talking with those who make all that happen. Not that they will be kept pure, but that the purity of the presence of Jesus will contaminate the mess and the struggle of living as a community, contaminate it with justice, which is love in action, contaminate with integrity and with wisdom. Jesus is not afraid to go into those situations that he was warned against, and nor should we be. And whatever else is going on in these stories, this is central, that Jesus actively overturns this keep out and keep safe idea by bringing something stronger, loving hope and faithful blessing. And if we are following him, where might that conviction take us? Not only in praying for others, but in acting ourselves and doing stuff. There are not only parallels between the stories, there are also contrasts. There's an adult and a child. And the healing of both reminds us that Jesus' system of valuing people is not based around the norms of the community around him. The norm around him would value an adult over a child, would value a man over a woman, so on. Jesus is there for both of them. There's also the can get there by herself, contrasting with the bedbound and dependent on other people to do it for her. But both are healed. And again, we see in that practice the outworking of what Peter sums up in the story in Acts. You remember the story in Acts where Peter is invited to go and preach to Cornelius. Cornelius is the centurion. We don't talk to centurions, okay? But he's invited to go and preach to the centurion, and he's very reluctant. And then he has the vision in which he sees a vast amount of animals. He's very hungry. He hears a voice saying, "Take and eat." And he says, "No, I will not take that which is unclean." He's a good Jew, he's going to stick with the clean food. And he hears the voice again saying, "What God has called clean, you should not call unclean." And so he takes and eats. And when all that's over, he is then invited again to Cornelius' house, and he goes. He shouldn't be going into a Gentile's house. He shouldn't be doing all that kind of stuff. But he goes and he preaches, and the Spirit comes as it came at Pentecost. And Peter sums it up. I see that God is no respecter of persons. That is, it's God who decides. Not our rules, not our expectations, not our cultural, historical norms, or any of the rest of it. God loves. And we see that in these contrasts. The one who can ask for help, who can exercise faith in whatever way she's doing it, and the one who can't, who's lying there comatose. Both are met by Jesus, both are healed by Jesus, both are restored to the community by Jesus. Doesn't make any difference. In the contrast, there's the assurance that what Jesus is doing is what matters, not the divisions that we normally see. But in those contrasts, the biggest one that's going on is between the insider and the outsider. And this is where the structuring of the story plays an important part as well. The woman who is healed is very much on the outside. She shouldn't be there. She's excluded from the community by her illness. She knows it. That's why she's hiding. The child is the insider. That's the way it's presented. Jairus is a leader in the synagogue. They are right in the center of the community. It's a family that's respectable and respected. And also we can see the whole community is involved in her story. There are messengers going to and fro, keeping everybody up to date with what's happening. There are mourners present. The family are being supported. They're being cared for. She and her whole family are held by the community as those who belong to them. So there's this contrast between insider and outsider. And both are healed. It's even more significant than that, and that's why the structuring of the story matters. Jesus is on his way to heal the insider, and he stops, and the outsider is healed and restored. The healing of the child is literally interrupted by the demands of the outsider and Jesus' attention to her. So what's going on in the story is not only that both the insider and the outsider are healed, but the insider isn't healed until the outsider is healed. Just pause on that for a moment. The insider is not healed, is not met by Jesus until the outsider is restored. Insider and outsider are words with all sorts of connotations. There are for all of us situations in which we feel like the insider and other places where we feel like the outsider. But I wonder overall where you would put yourself. And I wonder where you'd put other people. The story suggests that wherever we find ourselves, we need each other in order to find and receive the fullness of living and God's blessing. And perhaps most significantly, those of us who in any situation find ourselves on the inside need those who are excluded, perhaps those whom we exclude, in order to be fully alive and restored. Now that's quite a thought. I mean, we all want to include. We're about inclusion. That's one of our central values. But that carries with it the possibility of at least the presupposition that such inclusion is better for those on the outside to come in. That's what inclusion is. We bring those on the outside in to be with us. And there are times when that is demonstrably true and important. Struggles to include children of differing abilities in one educational system is based on the conviction that isolating children in groups based on capacity is limiting and denies opportunities. So bring people into the system. Trying to ensure that the same level of health care extends to all and not only to those with money or living in a certain postcode. That is an expression of that bring people in and share the goods all around. We could go on with that. But there's something else going on here too. Let's try it this way. The story is not about those of us with certain privileges conveying a blessing when we share them with others or invite others in to share them. Rather, the stories are to do with where do we find Jesus' presence and God's activity. And the ones on the inside cannot encounter Jesus, cannot receive the gifts of life and hope and restoration until Jesus has done it for the ones on the outside. Until the situations are reversed, where the one on the outside has been declared to be the insider. Go, daughter, your faith has made you whole. And then the one who's been excluded because of the delay, because of the wait, because we're doing something else, can also be restored. There are always those who will gatekeep the church and the promise and the presence of God. We see it in our own generation around issues of gender and sexuality, but it turns up in every generation in different forms. But similarly, if you examine renewal movements in church history, you can tell I've been teaching, can't you? I've been teaching church history yesterday. If you examine renewal movements in church history, one of the things they have in common is that they don't start at the centre. They gain energy and vitality not from the powerful and the significant people in the church, but from the unnoticed and the excluded. Look at the stories of the early Baptists. One of the first Baptists we know about is called John Smith. I mean, how down to earth and just basic can you get? Just an ordinary preacher. But even more significant, because when we read about the big movements of change and renewal in the church, and we read about those who lead them, they look to us like important figures because they become important figures in the history. They're not at the time. Martin Luther was a university lecturer in an obscure new university, not even one of the major universities, and he had a tendency to depression and constipation that made him a misery to be around. John Wesley was a failed minister and missionary who had been sent home in disgrace from the United States, and his first congregation were people coming up from the pits in Bristol. He wasn't even allowed to preach in the churches. The Salvation Army started when the preachers moved outside the church to live and work in the slums of the East End amongst people with whom you didn't mix because it was dangerous. We could go on with that, and you'll be glad to know I'm not going to, because my point is the renewal, the change, the life-giving presence of Jesus starts at the edge. It may find its way inside, may come into the centre, but it starts at the edge. And as we think about our future, we need to take that on board. I spoke last week about ways to think about the ministry in a few years' time. Maybe even start thinking about it now. What is being said by the people who are not here? By outsiders to this community that we need to hear? Where is the outside point where Jesus might be pausing to do something that will open up the possibility of our renewal in here, our hearing of the word spoken to the child, arise? And as we reflect on our life as a community, it's also about our lives individually. Where are the edges, where are the excluded parts of ourselves where healing and life might be the gift that Jesus is waiting to give us, which might renew our whole self? You know, that bit of yourself that is so uncomfortable and that you try to ignore, a sense of weakness or of incapacity or guilt, failure, even shame. The things we don't like, we try to keep outside. Perhaps that's the place where Jesus has paused and is waiting to heal if we dare to reach out. And then our insider bit, the bits that are strong and gifted and that we are proud of and pleased with quite rightly, might also be renewed and blessed with being a blessing. And when we're stuck, when we feel like nothing is changing that should be changing, when our sense of the distance of God is more significant than our sense of the nearness of God, then these stories might be important to us. Perhaps there is a broken, excluded part of ourselves that is struggling to reach out, to find what is needed in life and hope rather than being shut out, being treated as unimportant or non-existent. And maybe if we pause and let Jesus bring healing there, then what we seek and long for in our strength and in our centre will also become present for us. The writer doesn't put these stories together by accident. The parallels between them show us that, and show us something really important about the involvement in the world we live in, being there without fear or anxiety of losing our identity as followers of Jesus. The contrasts serve to emphasize again for us that central truth that God is no respecter of persons, that love, mercy, grace, renewal, hope, those are gifts to all, regardless of all the things that we recognize as putting people into categories. And finally, the links between those two stories call us to a deep conversion, to the recognition that if we are seeking Jesus, if we are seeking to follow him, to know him, to be his community, then it's on the edge of society, on the edge of this community, on the edge of ourselves, that we will find his presence. Since it's only as the outsider is healed that the insider can be. And that must give us pause for thought and for prayer.